Okay, so welcome to another episode of Opinionate, where high school students and their guests simplify, depoliticize, and democratize discourse on some of the most hotly debated issues today. In this episode, we discuss whether it is morally obligatory for an individual to be vegetarian. We're pleased to have two vegetarians, Jamie, that's the correct pronunciation, sorry, and
Yeah.
Ian as guests. Thank you. Jamie was born and raised vegetarian and is mostly vegan, whereas Ian's conversion to vegetarianism was a conscious decision in adulthood. Jamie and Ian's they attempt to not use any form of animal products such as cow's milk and animal leather. We're also pleased to have two non-vegetarians, my fellow high school student friend Kevin, and myself, who's currently sort of on the fence. So so we're gonna start by outlining some arguments on why exactly it's wrong for an individual to buy and eat meat. Then we're going to discuss the most prevalent objections to these arguments on the internet and in my school community. After that, we're going to get into some worries that are taken more seriously by some philosophers, but lack discussion on the internet. So let's start. Mr. McClinton, you said that you became vegetarian for moral reasons. Could you please share with us your thought process as to how the decision came about?
Yeah, if I give you just a little bit of background to where I first came across vegetarianism as a way of life. Um, I come from a very let's call it a very working class family. My childhood was very much set in stone. You always had meat and two vegetables for your evening meal. My mother, I would have said, was not a very good cook. My father didn't cook at all, and food was a rather boring thing. And then when I became a student at university, I started becoming aware of a huge diversity in kind of world food culture and eating much more diversely. At that point, I became vegetarian during my student years. I think really, although I had moral arguments at that point, I think honestly, looking back on it, I was probably more vegetarian for purely financial reasons. I was a poor student, and it was simply more efficient to be vegetarian. Meaning, I will say that I've eaten meat for the larger part of my life, and I like meat. I like the taste. I don't object to it on any kind of level of disgust in the taste or the thought of that. I do like meat. I like the smell of bacon. I like the smell of a barbecue. Certainly during my student years, I was vegetarian. It was practical. It was sensible. And yes, I cloaked it in a kind of moral argument that I was somehow doing the right thing and I was superior for being vegetarian. I then, when I started working and had a little bit more money, simply went back to eating meat. you know,
I see.
and I'm saying all of this in hindsight, looking back on my life. I don't think that's what I was thinking at the time, but that's the way my mind was working. I then went through a period of kind of morally trying to argue in favor of eating meat. I went through beliefs that said, well, if you can eat what we used to call happy meat, meaning if you could eat from animals that had been well cared for and looked after and free in their lives, then that was somehow better than eating from the industrial farm complex. I then said, well, if you could kill an animal yourself, then you were closer to nature somehow. And that gave you the kind of moral right to eat the animal that you were killed, in the sense that some cultures will sort of pray to the animal they have now killed and give it thanks for providing food and sustenance for them. I've been through all of that. I think eventually, at some point in my life, I just simply felt that I could not really uphold those. Those arguments all had massive holes in them for me, until eventually I just became straight out vegetarian again.
So,
Yeah,
like, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
yeah, that's really cool that you mentioned how like you thought about only eating like happy meat. I
Yeah.
think that is definitely a position of many who don't want to give up their moral beliefs, but
Yeah.
also just want to like eat meat. And I will definitely come back to it later. Henry, you can
Yeah.
continue.
Okay.
Yeah.
For me, there is no
So,
such thing as happy meat.
wait,
Yeah,
why is
that's
that?
Well, so would you like to be kept in a cage and have your movements and your life controlled, but be treated nicely? Just there is no difference to me. You're going to be killed. It's murder. Either way, there's no such thing. It's still captivity. It's still controlling something's will, right? You're
Mhm.
controlling
Right.
actions, movements, behaviors. You are There is no such thing. I don't care if it was on a nice green pasture and you're roaming free. You're still raising that animal to kill it. And that's still murder. And it's not necessary.
Well, I definitely agree that, like, by and far, most people probably use the word in advertisement. They probably exaggerate it. I've seen advertisement that says, like, the animal is raised in a stress-free environment. I am sure that's probably just, like, a slogan they use. Um, but, but on the point of, like, roaming free, though, like, my father, he owns a kind of, like, a Buddhist place where they have cows, and they really, like, let them roam free. And they only kill them when they're going to die naturally anyways, um, in, like, a short period of time. So I think that it's possible, like, in this sense, to have a kind of happy meat, although I'll definitely agree with you that most animal products on the market do not meet this kind of high standard.
Yeah. I want to like sort of like talk about like the happy meat thing, because like, like what if these animals, right? Like they were born like sort of if and only if like they were going to be like, like killed and like eaten. So like if these animals have a life that like is worth living, why is it that like why might it be not okay to eat them, like kill them and eat them?
So basically, what you're saying is domesticating or raising animals and forcing animals to procreate for the sake of our sustenance, for our taste buds or our supposed health, um, or ability to live. So for me, the argument goes back to the captivity again. Why would it be necessary to raise animals just for you to eat them?
Well, it wouldn't be necessary, but they would rather live like in captivity than like never to exist, I suppose.
Henry,
I,
I think
I
you should
wouldn't.
explain the non-identity part a bit more.
Okay, so like imagine like there's this cow, like that's like this happy cow, like free range happy cow, like on this pasture, like he's called like I don't know, Hank, right? And like this cow would have now like this cow, like Hank, was born like if and like only if it was to be like killed, like slaughtered, like maybe like I don't know 5 years later and like eaten. But Hank has like a relatively happy life. Like his life like is still worth living despite like being controlled and like like given antibiotics and like stuff like that. So like the idea is that since Hank's life is like worth living, it's like better than like nothing. It's okay to like to like kill and eat him, because if we were not to kill and eat Hank, like Hank would have never existed in the first place.
Okay, Can I just jump in here with my thoughts on this? I think what we have is, because I'm not arguing for happy meat. I'm just saying that was a phase in my life where I would have used that type of argument. But the problem is that we now have literally, millions and millions of animals that we as humans have reared and genetically manufactured through inbreeding and crossbreeding to get a particular type of animal that provides more milk or provides more meat or whatever. Those animals themselves can't actually, if we just let them go and be happy and free, they can't actually survive themselves. They don't have. They've reached a stage of inbreeding where they would all just die. Because they've been so domesticated that you can't just let them go. You have to look after them. So that's about a crossover phase from meat eating society to a vegetarian society. What do you do with all those animals? That's a little bit of a practical problem that is a sideline from a moral imperative.
Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, like, after they return to the wild, do you think that the whole process ends there? I mean, do we have an obligation to try to remove the natural evil that happened to them? Well, animals in nature, they certainly kill each other in a bunch of brutal ways. And a lot of times they live in constant anxiety of predators and so on. Do you think that, like, perhaps we can do something more for them after we release them back into the wild?
I actually don't think animals live in constant fear and anxiety. I think that animals and predators and the natural way of wild existence for animals has nothing to do with fear or unhappiness. It's just their life. I don't think that they're constantly running around worried about the next thing that's going to come kill them. They're just existing. However, back to Henry's point about Hank the cow, how do you know? Oh, I think we have a internet connection problem. Are we okay?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
So how do you know? How do you know that Hank would prefer to exist rather than not exist? Would you prefer to be captive or non-existent? I myself would prefer non-existence. I wouldn't want to live in that situation where I was held captive, whether or not my existence was peaceful and happy or not. That's taking away my own freedom. And I don't think it's fair to say that how can we pretend to know what Hank's feeling?
Right. I mean, we can never like. It's hard to know like something for sure, right? Like we sort of have to like go with sort of like a hypotheses or like conjecture. Like it seems like my life is worth living. Like even if like I would have been like I was like held captive for most of my life. Yeah, that's a good point. Sort of. I'm
It's
not quite
true.
sure about that.
If you think about it like that, we're all to some degree held captive to some. What is the phrase? You got to serve somebody. Everybody's serving somebody else. So we're all in that sense held captive. But do we think that our lives therefore are not worth living?
Yeah, I
don't.
think
I
that.
think my life's worth living as well. So
I guess the
Yeah.
thing is, though, we have choice. Hank never had a choice. And I don't feel that it's right to take those choices away or create an environment where we're not giving a choice to something that cannot defend itself, nor speak for itself, nor advocate for itself. I feel like this is very simple. The question is it kind? Is it kind to murder an animal for your taste buds? Is it kind to keep an animal captive for your own benefit? And my answer is simple. It's not kind. So why would I contribute to that?
I want to push a bit on the previous point about animals in nature. So I read an article like some time ago that says like only 5% of animals die of old age in nature and 95% just go killed by whatever predator they have. And I also read, a book by Schopenhauer in which he depicted like millions of turtles just climbing on shore just to be eaten. And those really remind me of what human beings' farms are. And sometimes the situation is even worse when they're literally like eaten alive by the wolves on that shore. So he went to this island and he saw this, and he thought maybe in some sense this is a kind of greater evil than human beings, because as brutal as our farms are, we at least kill it in, well, um, the good farms at least try to kill it in a quick way rather than nature, which kills it in the slow way. And this makes me wonder if, that characterization of nature as like a free and happy place isn't really that true. And we kind of have an obligation to fix nature in a way.
No, I think it's interesting the words that you're choosing to use, Kevin, because you're describing the natural world as being evil and brutal and savage and violent, and I'm not sure that we necessarily are the caretakers of that situation. There is nothing evil and brutal in the natural order.
Well,
That's a humanistic approach, saying that the world out there is evil and brutal
and needs to be fixed.
and needs to be fixed in some way. I'm not sure that we can actually assume that the antelope is thinking that just before it gets devoured by the lion. The rest of the antelopes look on and say, "Okay," and then they move on. They're within some kind of natural cohabitation and existence,
where they're killing to eat, not just killing for out of choice. They are actually killing because they need to sustain themselves, whereas humans do not need meat to sustain themselves. Okay, there may be isolated situations. Inuits may need to kill seals. Fine, we can't. I don't feel that we can judge that as right or wrong. It's just the way that they are living. But millions of people have the choice. We have the ability, and I think that we have the responsibility to use that choice to actually prevent the violence that we are perpetrating on beings who have no voice.
Mm-hmm. Well, you pointed out that like saying that nature is evil is like from a human point of view, and I agree with that. I think that only human beings can be subject to moral laws and so on. But I still think that these dying and misery are happening on an objective level. 95% are killed, and we can prevent that. So in a way, it's our omission dying.
But,
and that's kind of like the killing and omissions thing, right? To kill something and to not do anything when they're killed.
Join in.
No, Kevin, I would say, why would we try to prevent a natural occurrence? Why would we try to prevent death? What is wrong with death?
Well,
we all
if
die.
there's a
Animals
volcano, if there's like a volcano or something, I'll try to, suppress the volcano so that people don't die and animals don't die.
Yeah. See, I think that I don't know. Mr. Ian and I have a very different approach to life and death. We are okay with the fact that things die, that accidents happen, that nature takes place. We don't feel the need to try to prevent things like that are natural occurrences, right? If you live next to a volcano, then you've chosen to live next to a volcano. Maybe you haven't because you've been born there, but we're not going to try to prevent natural disasters. We can prevent the things that we choose to contribute to, right? We could actually control what we eat, what we buy. We can't prevent natural disasters, and we certainly can't prevent death. It's just life.
Yeah, I think there's definitely, so there are things that happen in nature that are definitely like we cannot intervene. Things like volcano, we can't really like stop a volcano. But there are also things in nature that we can prevent to some extent. For instance, like diseases. Diseases happen naturally, they happen in nature. We can prevent it to an extent. Like I'll use domestic animals. So if there's a kind of like flu that goes on around like cows or chicken, we can kind of prevent that by vaccinating them. So we can prevent this kind of things that happen in nature. And like it would make their life better. So like I mean, this is all hypothetical, and it's definitely relatively insignificant compared to the degree of harm that we're doing to domestic animal. But after solving that harm, preventing them from harming themselves be a kind of um harm.
Harm reduction.
I don't
Wait,
know. Okay.
before we go on, I have like two questions. So like first, like how like why is it that like why might it be that we're like morally obliged to prevent harm like for animals? And like two, how is this like related to being like vegetarian?
I don't think we're morally obligated to prevent harm to animals in nature. I believe that we're obligated to choose kindness when we can, and that means the purpose of this interview is about vegetarianism. So choosing kindness is choosing not to contribute to violent murder, death, captivity of animals who have no choice. But in nature, I would not try. I mean, it might break my heart to see an antelope be killed by a lion, but in nature, I have respect for that. That animal has to eat and live as well. We don't need it. We don't need to contribute to that.
Um. Well. Well, again, like hypothetically, the animal don't really need to, and we can have birth control to decrease the magnitude. We can also do things that are less intrusive, like we can stop diseases from happening in nature. Um, by the various means we control disease in human population. And personally, I am really utilitarian, which means I really buy into the acts and omissions principle, and I think I should spell it out a bit more. So, like, throughout the conversation, there seems to be a kind of distinction between me going out and killing animals and sitting back and watching animals die. And for me, this is not like a real moral distinction. Um, for instance, like, I don't want to fight a war. I think it's wrong to fight a war, but I also think it's wrong to have a war happen and just sit back and watch. Um, so you said things like we don't want to contribute to the issue, but I think that we also don't want to just ignore the issue or to not take action and let the consequence happen. So
I don't feel sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Kevin, I can't quite understand where the antelope being eaten by the lion becomes defined as a war zone
Or an issue.
or an issue. That's not a war zone. That's
mhm.
the natural order. And I'm not going to go about neutering lions to control their population. It seems to me that the more human interference, the worse things get. Flus and viruses break out because we're feeding antibiotics and stuff to animals. Disease itself is a control factor in life. It is the natural control factor. It's not a problem, it's a solution. Diseases are solutions. When animals are left alone in the wild, they control their own birth rates. They choose how much needs to be done to maintain the balance between all of the animals. It's a known fact that when animals feel that there are too many of one species, they lower their own birth rates.
And actually, they do it with nature. There are certain plants who actually will put out certain chemicals to help
Mhm.
to actually ward off animals from eating them. So that's like a sign to the animals that are foraging that we need to slow down a bit. We are reproducing too quickly. So they will actually the nature itself will actually produce things in its leaves so that it says it's a repellent, right? So their nature is in harmony, except for when interference happens by us because we think we know better. And for wars,
Um,
I would not. I don't think the ends justifies the means. I don't believe in violence. I don't believe in killing. I don't believe in one country's right above another's. I don't. I would not participate in war, no matter what. And I would prefer to stand by and watch everybody else have their incredible, um, power struggles. I'd rather watch because I would not participate. That would be a statement
okay.
in itself.
Right.
So
And I just
let's
want to
back off from this.
conclude this. I'll just conclude this by like, so you've said that the natural order of things have a kind of righteousness to it that is, people may think as like this ecological ideology and so on. Then how would you say to someone who eats meat because they argue it's a kind of natural thing to do? And of course, we all agree that's not necessary for us to eat meat. They'll also argue that, well, it's not necessary for some omnivorous animal to eat meat also, but it's natural for them to eat some meat and some grass. So how would you respond to someone who used this argument?
I think we're back to the notion of we have choice, and if we can choose in any way possible, whether this is a discussion about vegetarianism or walking on grass, do least harm is a reasonable principle to live your life by, you know. And of course, everybody has to make some kind of moral decision on what they define as least harm. I perfectly understand the Inuit who lives out on the icy tundra somewhere, and his main source of any kind of food is seal blubber. Doing least harm would simply be going and killing a seal and eating it. And I don't have any moral obligation, moral disgust at that kind of scenario. But in my situation, I feel like least harm for me would be to not inflict pain, suffering, torture as part of an industrial meat complex on billions of animals. Somebody could argue that the broccoli hurts as well when I cut it from the ground, and that's a fair enough point. Plants, emit terror signals when they feel that they're being ravaged. So maybe I'm causing harm to the plant. But is that least harm? Possibly, yes.
I think we are causing harm to plants as well. But yes, just like Mr. Ian said, I mean, we are here and we choose to live. So I can't exist at this point on sunlight and water alone until somebody figures it out. Then maybe I would try. I wouldn't be opposed. But at this point, I need some plants. So yes, I do feel that I am harming the plant world, but I have chosen my least harm.
So let's move on to the debate on like, you know, I mean, we agree that it's wrong to produce meat, especially farm meat, like especially like factory farm meat, right? But like, how does that how does that link to the individual's obligation to not eat meat, right? Because well, consider this case, right? So suppose that there is a landlord that you're paying rent to, right? Now, you refuse to eat meat, but you understand that you know that the landlord is going to use part of your rent to buy meat that is wrongfully produced. So, if it is wrong to eat meat, would it also be wrong to sort of not pay rent to that landlord? Um, like how far does the individual's obligation go, right? Would I be obliged to also do political work as to advocating for people to stop eating meat?
That's about conversion, right? Like trying to convert others to your thinking of what is right and wrong. I spent a good deal of my maybe 20s trying to convert others and being very angry at people when we discussed and debated whether or not it was right or wrong to eat animals. But as I got older, I realized it's not my job to convert the world. It's just a bee. There you go. It's not my job, and really, actually, I think that when you do get angry and upset at people for what their behavior is, then you're only going to reinforce it. So for me, I just speak my own truth, talk about what I see, and I don't worry about trying to convert other people. So if my landlord eats meat, and I'm positive our landlord does eat meat, and I am supporting that, right? It's just like saying I'm not going to give money to a homeless person on the street because they're only going to buy drugs with it. I'm still going to give money to that homeless person because it's kind. and I'm still going to pay my rent, even if my landlord does eat animals, because that's that's their choice, right? I don't have a say in what other people do. I can only control my actions.
So Kevin, how would you respond to that? Because you said like you wouldn't make a distinction between like doing something and letting something happen, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't make that distinction, but I think some people they do make the distinction. For example, when it comes to the trolley problem, that's what most people do implicitly. They make the decision between omission and act. Um, but like, I guess my question would be like, this is not really a yes/no problem. I think it's more like a magnitude problem. So I'll start by asking like, how bad exactly is it to eat meat? Like, I'll try to be more specific by asking, like, do you think that there's a good moral analogy between animals and humans? So some philosophers have argued that when you look at animals, when you look at humans, and you ask yourself, like, what's the morally relevant thing? Like, what makes it so that this thing should not be harmed? And philosophers tend to answer with the capacity to experience happiness and pain. So this is because if you choose any other property, like intelligence or consciousness or conscientiousness and so on, you have part of the human species who don't have, unfortunately, that property. But we believe that every single human should deserve moral right. So we ask, well, what is a shared attribute of all human? And one of them would be the capacity to experience pain and happiness. So if you really believe that this is the property, then some philosophers would follow up by saying that, oh, animals have this property too. And so they agree that there's a perfect analogy between humans and animals. So I wonder, like, what's your thought on that? Do you think that there's a perfectly good analogy, or do you think that, there's some other property that may come in and makes it imperfect?
I think that if you've ever interacted with a pig,
Mhm.
pigs are wonderfully intelligent animals. They do perfectly understand the concept of happiness and pain, sorrow, misery, joy. They're intelligent enough to predict scenarios at least some distance into their own futures. They have memories. They dream. You can physically see them dreaming and running about in fields of clover in their dreams. At what point do I need to stop for people to understand that obviously that these are all what we would all like to attribute to human beings as well? Yeah, all of these abilities. That would, to me, be a very strong signal to say that I should not be the one killing that animal.
And
Yeah, and also I don't think we need a perfect analogy, like to sort of like to say that we have an obligation not to eat meat, right? Like some of the most famous like advocates like Peter Singer and like Shelley Kagan, right? They just say that like like the difference is so small such that we like we really can't justify like doing this to humans like doing this to animals if we cannot justify doing this to humans.
Mm-hmm.
But I think like the core problem here is that like how do we sort of go from like saying that the production of factory farm meat is wrong to like to say that the consumption of factory farm meat is wrong, right? Because if consuming factory farm meat is wrong by virtue of like of incentivizing more production of those like animals, like new breeding of those animals, then similarly paying rent to your landlord who's gonna buy like those meat also sort of incentivizes like the same thing, right? The same like breeding of animals. So where does our obligation stop, right?
I think, just like the kind of butterfly effect, all interactions that we have can somewhere down the line have negative effects, undesirable for me as a person. So yes, if I pay rent to the landlord, am I therefore supporting the meat industry? because he might buy it to you he might use the money to eat the flesh of another living thing. Yes, that's absolutely true. Equally, but does that also follow, therefore, that if I listen to Michael Jackson, am I in some way supporting the rights of pedophiliacs? I have to interact with the world, and sometimes that interaction may be construed and be taken in its negativity. I can't avoid that. And I don't really believe that I should stop paying rent to this person rather than that person, because although actually I probably would prefer to choose my landlord and say, I like you more than the other, so I think I'll pay to you and not to this person. But ultimately, how do I know that their son or daughter doesn't eat meat and they're getting money from the landlord I've just paid money to? There will always be an effect somewhere down the line.
I think in an ideal world, I would love it if I could live and exist in an environment where every person I interacted with was chose not to eat animals. That for me, the closest I've been to that most recently was in Indonesia, in Bali, where 90% of the citizens there are Hindu, and they don't eat animals. So I would love it, and I think that yes, I think that if we really chose to be committed to our values, then we could do that. I guess what I'm saying is, I guess we're not all that committed, are we? If we're choosing, I'm choosing to live in a country that does heavily promote eating animals, in a place where I can very rarely find anything vegan or vegetarian, and that is contributing to the destruction of animals. So yeah, in a way, I am wrong, and I think that's a really good point. In a lot of things that I do, I'm contributing to harm, but I can control this one thing. If I'm choosing to live in a country because I'm choosing to make a certain amount of money, and I'm choosing a certain lifestyle, I mean, I am making those choices that are probably go against my own values. That's very true. So in a way, we're hypocrites, all of us. But yeah, so I choose the easiest thing I can control, and that's what I eat.
I think like it's not necessarily like wrong to like pay the the landlord like the rent, right? I feel like there must be some morally relevant difference between like buying meat and like allowing people to buy meat, right? So Kevin, what do you think about that? Like, do you think that there's a distinction?
I think that like our shared existence um in a relatively developed region of a relatively developed country, our shared existence perpetuates a kind of system that is inherently unjust in many ways. Um, but I mean, I think this is quite controversial, but there's this idea called like uh moral fetishism. Is that like if you want to be perfectly moral, um then like the difference between our self and the ideal moral self is so far, like if you according to moral philosophers, is so far that maybe you think that it's theoretically wrong, but it's practically okay. But again, this is like a super controversial idea, but like that's what some philosophers would say. And also, I don't think that it's really relevant to this debate in particular, because our debate is about whether we should be vegetarians. And it's not about whether we should be vegetarians and do all these other things. So I think that we can return to the core debate around vegetarianism, because if you're not even willing to make this first step, what about the talk of the further steps? So that's what
Yeah.
I'll say.
That's a fair point, Kevin.
Yeah.
It's moving us away from our original debate. Well done.
So what is it that links like this wrongfulness of production to this wrongfulness of like consumption?
Yeah, I have an issue with right and wrong. Like, I know that I believe there are some things that are right and wrong, but I try to stay away from labeling things right and wrong, bad or good. that's why I said initially, I go back to the question: is it kind? I don't know that there's right and wrong. That's just too black and white. There's so many different variations in between. The Inuits, are they wrong? And why not? It's not that. It's not. I guess it's not that easy. So.
But I suppose you're saying right and wrong are contextual.
There is, and I also believe that there is no truth. Nothing is true, and that everything is true. So it's a really difficult argument. All I can say is, for me, eating animals is not kind. For me, killing a bee is not kind. Killing a mosquito is not kind. Killing a spider is not kind. So killing isn't kind. And so I try to refrain from that as much as possible.
For your information, there's a bee right beside me.
I know.
Yes, I know.
Just,
but Henry, if I can add just back to what you're saying, like between production and consumption, my older daughter has an interesting way of looking at this, and I don't know whether this would work for some people or not. It doesn't work for me, but it might work for some people. She will at times eat meat, but only if that meat has been discarded by others. In other words, she's not the person paying the money to feed into the consumption production industry. Okay, you've probably heard of like dumpster diving, where people will go around dumpsters looking for what the restaurants have just thrown out, kind of thing. And in that sort of scenario, she thinks it's okay, because in that case she'll be consuming something that is not directly monetarily feeding back into the production of more. And she feels that in that sense she's doing a good thing by not wasting something, and I've certainly heard lots of people say, well, what's the problem now? It's already dead, so we might as well eat it. In other words, it would be wasteful to take this dead. In some senses, it's wasteful not to use leather because the animal's been killed for the meat anyway. So shouldn't we make good use of all parts of that animal that has already been destroyed? Would it be morally correct then to actually use the leather and not throw away? I understand those arguments, but again, it's back to what an individual might feel that they are personally comfortable with,
Yeah, I think there's a key distinction between like dumpster diving and like buying stuff, right? Because buying stuff, you're feeding into the economy, right? Like the companies are going to adjust their supply based on like the demand, like in which you're part of. But dumpster diving, you're not feeding into the demand, so I guess there's nothing wrong with dumpster diving, right?
But
I understand my daughter's opinion. I wouldn't do it,
Wait, so if like they go to a restaurant and like her friend ordered meat, would she eat the meat?
I cannot answer for her. I don't know. I don't think so. I think it would be her moral orientating around how directly connected was she to the payment for that product. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's kind of like my father's position because he is a really devout Buddhist. So he believed that seafood, there's a long, like, weird story behind that, but he believed that seafood have a special kind of moral position so that we should not eat seafood. But then, like, if I order seafood when I go out to a restaurant, like, he will eat it. Like, the only thing he's against is ordering seafood himself. And I just find that, like, it's out of a good intent, but I just think that it's kind of like a bit hypocritic on his side.
Yes.
So like when I heard that story, that was like the situation that I was wondering, like in like a family like dinner, would she be okay as long as she didn't order it? And that's like what I'm most skeptical of. But dumpster diving, I'm not sure for the U.S. and in China, it's not like something we do, so I'm not sure how that really happens. Yeah.
So I think for Ian's daughter, she worked at a what was it, like a cafe that also sold prepackaged sandwiches and lunch items. And at the end of the day, the company, if it was like it has an expiration date, right, but it was perfectly edible, they still would throw it away. So I think in her case, it was seeing the actual waste that a company produced, and wanting to kind of alleviate that waste somehow, or make the slaughter of an animal at least have more. There was a reason for it, so instead of it just going to rot in a dumpster.
I think that's a really good thing, and I think expiration dates are just a trick of capitalism in a way.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. Yeah.
But okay, but I think there's a bit. So if we try to justify this by considering the overall impact of a person on, let's say, the demand slope of the meat industry, then what would you say to someone who eats meat, but every time he eats meat, he donate like a certain amount? So like it's kind of like the carbon tax, or not the carbon tax,
Yeah.
but like buying off carbon credit. Like he buys off meat credits, and every time he eats meat, he just buys some of that credit, so that the overall impact of his eating on the demand is zero. What would you say to that kind of person?
Still cruel. You're still contributing to cruelty and violence for no reason. And paying
Well,
a
he's
tax
not
is like
contributing.
donating. Well, yeah, if you're eating an animal, you are contributing to their violent death. And paying a tax is trying to alleviate guilt, like donating to a charity once in a while because you feel bad.
Wait, I guess
But
we can.
like his tax will prevent other people from eating meat. Like his tax would actually like lower the demand. For instance, like this is quite ideal, but if he's a really rich person and he donates like a lot of money to like a vegetarian like charity that has a real impact on on like the meat industry, then if he donates that magnitude of money, that is definitely going to prevent a lot of people from eating meat, but then he eats meat himself. Um, like you can't say he's creating a bad impact, can you? Like if you look at the demand curve, like he existing and he existing would lower the demand curve. For me, like in this
I
scenario.
think. Yeah, I think I can like deal with that by like non-identity, right? Because like right, if this person like does not eat meat, like if he does not eat meat right now, like Hank, like is not going to be born. But if he eats meat and he donates, right? Hank like wait, if he eats meat but he does not donate, Hank like is gonna wait, if he doesn't eat meat, Hank is not going to be born, right? This
Yeah.
cow Hank. But if he doesn't eat meat, but no, if he does eat meat, but yet donates, Hank is gonna be born. Although some other cow, maybe Henry, wouldn't be born. So like either way, like he's just like sort of shifting like the suffering of one cow to another, and like that wouldn't be justifiable even if the total like suffering of like any cow, like regardless of it being Henry or Hank, decreases, because you wouldn't do that to humans, right? It wouldn't matter if like the total suffering of farmed humans decreased, like because like in principle, categorically, it's not okay. That's sort of theoretical.
Why wouldn't I though? Why
One or a
wouldn't I? Like
thousand to a pool.
like suppose I can donate. I have a money to donate to charity. I was gonna donate to this charity, which is gonna prevent the death of like one person. But then like I checked the internet, I found another more effective charity, so I donate to that one instead. Like what's the problem with that?
Well, there's no problem with that, because in that case, you're not really doing a categorical evil in that case. But in this
Wait,
case,
but
because
you
you are
said
also
okay, so you're saying that we cannot do this with evil? Well,
no, I'm
well,
saying
like
that
I'll just give. I mean, I don't see. Okay, I'll just give an easy example then. Like I I divert the damage that's going to be done on this person, and I divert it onto someone else. But the damage is reduced. Like, what's the problem with that?
So, Kevin,
no.
maybe you could put humans, maybe substitute animals for humans and ask yourself the same question. If it was a cannibal, right? But then they gave money to kind of contribute to the non-cannibal eating campaigns, is it still okay? They ate one human, but they're still donating the rest of their money to just, it's okay.
To tell other people not to.
minimize, don't eat humans, but I'm going to eat mine because I've just donated money to decrease the eating of humans. Would it be okay to you?
Well, if you really ask me, because I'm a hard utilitarian, I'll say, I think the answer yes is defendable. Like, I don't take the answer yes because I'm not a hard utilitarian, but I get how it's defendable because, you know, if you give me two Earth, like Earth number 1 and Earth number 2, and on Earth number 2 there's this guy who does this, I want to live in Earth number 2. Like, because in Earth number 2, I have a smaller chance of being eaten, and an average person have a smaller chance of being eaten. So I would like to live with him on like a planet with him. Like, so like if I want to make that choice, then I probably should, admit him.
Okay. How about if we change the argument then to babies?
Mhm.
Human babies.
Well, it'll be uncomfortable to live with him, but again, like if I'm gonna be born, I want to minimize my chance of being eaten by a cannibal. So I would want these people, because they do objectively decrease my chance of being eaten, as a baby,
Okay.
even though he eats babies himself. Which
Very interesting.
I think, Kevin, your argument, in terms of pure logic and math, works perfectly well. Obviously, the greater good becomes the person who is, in the long term, the greater good is the person who is eating meat but donating to the vegetarian campaign. But that kind of takes us pretty far away from the notion of personally doing the least harm and personally being involved in the direct pain and anguish and mutilation of another living creature. You're kind of ameliorating the situation by paying off your debts to society and the world. In that case, the argument then becomes what is right and wrong with the whole idea of charity. Charity in itself we can have another radio show on that, because charity in itself is a very problematic area,
Wait, yeah, I want to add to like I want to add like I want to like reject Kevin, but by saying no, I want to rebut Kevin, but by saying that like if we are to admit like the intuition that it's okay to pay like the rent to the landlord who's gonna eat meat, then we should choose to not eat meat instead of like eat meat and donate, because like substituting these like animals like with humans, right, or human babies, like if I eat and donate, right, Hank as a human baby is going to suffer, but Henry and Jerry are not going to suffer because they probably wouldn't exist in the first place because I donated. But if I don't eat meat, right, Hank is not going to suffer, although other people are going to cause Henry and Jerry to be born and like suffer. Well, other people are gonna cause Henry and Jerry to be born and suffer. My landlord is going to cause people to be born and suffer. So if we are to admit that it's okay to pay the rent, we should also say that it's not okay to eat and donate.
well, the problem with rent is that it's more general. If you think that's okay to pay the rent, well, well, like my position would then be it's not okay for you to pay the rent. Like the logical consequence of my position would be it's not okay, and I would see how people could motivate the intuition that would be wrong to pay the rent. Like I think this is a defendable position. So like, what's your argument coming from? I mean,
No, the argument is like we first admit that it's okay to pay the rent, and based on that, we say that it's not okay to eat and donate, but okay to just not eat the meat.
well,
Right?
why
Because
would a
like I take it
utilitarian
that
agree
we
with
have
your premise?
the method
Why?
of ethics. The method of ethics I'm using, like we have to base our theories on like some more like confident intuitions where we have like
But I don't
intuitions
see
we're
how the
most confident in.
intuition. But I don't see how the intuition that we ought to pay the rent. I don't think that's a really clear cut intuition. So I'll just reject on that ground.
Oh, it's
I
not
think
okay. Here. Yeah, go ahead.
I think it is in the big picture is morally reprehensible to pay the rent. It is not the good position to be in at all. But the problem becomes between that and me having to live in the practical everyday world. So I make lots of choices in my life that I think are really morally reprehensible, but I have to live.
Yeah, I'm saying that like the individual's responsibility would be too much if you say that like it's not okay to pay the rent, right? Because that would mean that it's not okay to like be friends with people who eat meat, like so
Yes,
on and so
yeah.
forth, right? That's just too much. So like at some point we have to make the cut, right?
Yeah.
Now if we cannot make the cut, like we should. I mean, well, we have to if we make the cut at like rent paying, for example, or something similar to that. That seems right? We have to make the cut somewhere.
Yes.
Okay.
There are a lot of actions that we take in everyday life that could be seen as harmful to many people. We don't question where our things come from and who makes them. You know, who made this and what animal was killed in the process. There's so many things that we can consider. We would have to live in an isolated bubble, and create our own goods and make our we'd have to make everything if we really wanted to be truly living the moral and virtuous life. But we are choosing not to. We're choosing to interact with the rest of society. But there are people who live in isolated, what they're called communes, and produce their own products and have their own food and have a very isolated way of existing that does the least harm possible. But that's, I guess, we're not there yet. We may never be.
Well, I think we all define our own least harm, because, again, even those that live in communes somewhere are somehow interacting. They're somehow, you'd find your arguments on how that is harmful in some way. So you try to live as best
Wait,
you can.
I actually want to say something about doing the least harm. Like a few months ago, like I also had this argument that like it is obligatory for us to like maximize the moral permissibility of our action, like the expected moral permissibility of our action. But like I feel like that's like not always the case, right? For example, like if Kevin asks like me to like help him get a hot cup of water, like it might burn him if I do that, right? So like it's not clear that it's pretty clear that like some things we do are like permissible, but it's not clear that like they are always the least harm or like the most permissible.
Yes.
I
Sometimes we
I
don't
want
know
to
too
like
late.
I actually want to I think that there's a more fundamental issue with the extent to which our moral obligations go. And I think the issue is this. In most major moral theories, be it deontology, the idea that there are moral laws, be it utilitarianism, maximizing happiness, it's impossible to be like beyond good. Like you cannot be altruistic in these moral frameworks because whatever you do, you're just doing like what is morally obligatory. For example, if you don't pay the rent, if you do all those things, you wouldn't be like a morally superb person. You'll just be a morally permissive person. And I think that's the issue, not with people, but with moral systems that simply don't allow you to be altruistic or anything. Like, Henry, like, can you be altruistic in utilitarianism? You cannot. No matter what you do, you're not altruistic. Like, that idea
No,
isn't
but
built into the moral framework. And that's the
no, I can
problem
be
with the moral
altruistic.
framework.
Well, we just take a different moral framework. We take like something like contrarianism, in which you can be altruistic,
Well, I'm
right?
talking about the moral framework that most people use. Contrarianism is not a very, well, okay, contrarianism. How would you be altruistic in that framework?
Well, it's not specified in like the social contract that like for example, I must I don't know, um, donate like half my income to like kids who are suffering in like I don't know Africa, right? It doesn't seem like it's specified in the
Oh,
contract that that's the
if it's not
case.
specified, then contrarianism has no say on it.
Well, no, it does, right? It says that like we actually, yeah. Uh, oh no,
Yeah, so
it is specified. It's specified that it's not that's a moral good, right? It's a moral good to donate
well,
half your income.
well
Well, is
then
it?
if you don't do it, you're breaking the social contract.
You're not. You can still be permissible, but not good, right?
Yeah, but we should be good, right? Like we
Define
have an
Bro,
obligation to be good.
good.
And that's
What
the
is the
problem.
definition of good?
Like in these theories, like being good isn't something that is superb. Like being good is something that we all should do. So
But,
there's a should
but
in
what
this,
is
which means
good?
it's no longer altruistic. Uh,
But
and I don't think altruistic is the best term. Um,
virtuous?
it's just being like beyond just acting obli by obligation. And I think that's a problem with a lot of moral theories. That's why I'm
Wait,
a
wait.
theorist. Like, um, I would say that there's a kind of virtue. Like, if you don't pay the rent, you're not just if you don't pay the rent to that landlord, you're not just being a good person, but you're also going beyond that. Um, and you're
but
being, let's just say, really good person. And I
but
think that's
Kevin,
what moral theories fail to capture. Yeah.
but Kevin,
Hmm.
you good is subjective. Where are
Right.
you? How are you defining the term good? I mean, your good could be very vastly different than my idea of good.
Well, it depends on your theory, of course. Every theory should postulate what is good, what's not good. And um, even if you have no theory, you still have an idea of what's good and not good.
Exactly.
And people have different theories, but these theories they're incompatible. So one of them is true, uh, and we may very well never know which one's true, but we'll choose the best one. Um, for me, the best one is based on virtue. For Henry, the best one is utilitarianism. Uh, no?
Mm, well, maybe preference utilitarianism, like Singer, but not
I
sure.
prefer not to put myself in a box and label myself a utilitarianist or a virtuous. I am just a person who wants to do as least harm as possible, to be as kind as possible. I don't need a philosopher or um, a set of rules to tell me what my least harm is. So I mean, but I'm also saying within each of those theories, are you saying that each of those theories has a different definition of good?
Well, you say that like you don't need a philosopher to tell you what's good. Um, but like, wouldn't you say, historically, philosophers have sometimes made really good judgments? For instance, like those. I mean, I don't want to go back that far, but those Enlightenment philosophers, their idea of human rights, isn't that like helpful in helping us distinguish between good and bad? Like the ideas they give, like all people are born equal. Um, isn't these ideas like kind of helping you in a way, like moral
No,
philosophy?
not me, because I tend to ignore history. I tend to I ignore people who say that they have the truth. I ignore things that
Hmm.
are defined as empirically proven. I don't believe there is a universal truth. I don't believe that history actually, I mean, yes, maybe it has helped people and it does help people, but I don't believe at this moment, I am not living my life thinking about what happened in history. I'm looking at my life and saying, what is happening now and how can I do the least harm possible? I don't need to think about history to make good choices for myself.
I think what Kevin
Right,
is
but
saying is like,
in some sense, like we are in history right now, and if historically theorizing and um, you might not like it, but like in history, perhaps theorizing about morality have been able to advance morality. So by induction or whatever, theorizing about it now could perhaps advance it for the future. And it doesn't make it like we have to see history as like something that's unchangeable or something that's absolute. It's just that I have worked in the past, so it might work for the future. Henry, what are you
I
gonna say?
think it is good to consider everything.
Yeah, I was just gonna say like, yeah, go ahead, go ahead. I think the fundamental, I think the fundamental
Well,
disagreement like between Jamie and Kevin is like Kevin thinks that like there are moral truth and like we can like have moral progress and like knowing these truths, but like Jamie thinks that there are no moral truth. I think that's what she's saying.
well, I'm not really. I don't have to commit myself to this abstract idea of moral truth, by saying that theorizing about morality is good, because we can totally theorize about morality without thinking that there is some kind of absolute truth. Um, for instance, we can talk about human rights without taking them as literally true. We can talk about utilitarianism without thinking it's literally true. And a thing about like whether we having moral progress. I mean, um, you may not think that when it comes to more complicated issues like human rights, but there's certainly less complicated issues, things like slavery, uh, things like colonialism, that do seem to be like, moral progress, no matter like which point you're coming from. I mean, there might not be like any absolute truth around slavery, but abolishing it is certainly moving us forward from different perspectives, forward relative to different people. And well, mhm. for example,
That's kind of
for
interesting.
example, like who would say that it's better to have slavery than to have this? I think they're better than slave. Like, I do recognize that there's modern slavery. In fact, like a few years back when the Qatar World Cup happened, I like posted a poster around the school around like modern slavery. But like generally, they are better like in terms of like condition than just slaves. Okay, one last thing, like this whole vegetarianism thing. You do like recognize that a lot of the people backing it are moral philosophers. And most people who are having a conversation on this are people who theorize about morality on an everyday basis. Wouldn't um, pushing forward the agenda of vegetarianism be a kind of moral progress that is um, pushed by theorists? Yeah.
But I think like but I think like it's I think like taking the route of like least harm is pretty good. Like I think like it's good enough like as a maxim, right? Because like it's very difficult for us to first of all know moral truth if they exist, and like I feel like it's reducible. Like we can reduce like those decision making simply to simply try to take the route of like least harm. So I guess that sort of justifies itself. Okay.
Well, first of all, if you think what's good is just to do the least harm, um, isn't it isn't really theorizing. It feels kind of circular to me.
No, I'm saying that
You
like
couldn't.
in fast processes, right? Like in daily lives when we have to make decisions, like there's no way you can not make a decision, right? So like in these in times when like when reflection is like impossible or like you can't realistically reflect, it's a good advice to like take the route of least harm. But we should theorize, I think.
Okay,
So
right. And I think that the cheetah thing, it's also how like the idea of harm is always kind of from someone's perspective, because maybe from the antelope's perspective, definitely there will be a lot of difference. But even from like our perspective, from a third person, maybe we'll think that well, the cheetah's cubs will like grow into cheetah and like kill more antelope like, every year. So we might think that it's actually a harm for their children to survive. So I mean, like yeah, and Mhm. yeah, and this problem is taken up by a very famous moral philosopher called Thomas Nagel, who wrote a book called The View from Nowhere. So, like he says, in order to be really practice moral philosophy, you have to practice it from the view of nobody, and he kind of explores this like dilemma of like whether we can really have this view from nowhere from which we can make moral judgments. Yeah, that would
so Kevin, are you gonna be vegetarian?
um I was actually vegetarian for like a year, for more reasons, but also because Hugo was vegetarian and I was like eating with him every day. So I kind of feel like this kind of pressure to vegetarians too. But but not not really. Not really.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, I guess, I guess it might be obligatory for me not to be vegetarian. So, like, it'd be wrong for me to eat meat, I guess. So that's the question, I guess. Like, if it is wrong, like, I shouldn't do it, right? Yeah, but for me, it is wrong. So I kind of have to deal with that. Okay. Any more comments? Me too. Okay, well, I guess thank you all for showing up, and I send you guys the recording, like to look at, like if there's any part you wanna like cut out or stuff, like you just let me know. All right. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you very much.